So, my goodness, it was quite a week. Yeah? Yeah. I think there's one phrase from this last week that sums up the bizarreness that it was. And that phrase is, I really don't care. Do you? Those were the words written on the back of Melania Trump's jacket on Thursday as she traveled to the Texas border to visit immigrant children. And as you all know, the children were traumatically separated from their parents as their families fled war-torn areas of Central America looking for safety and a better life here in the United States. After all, this is the land of opportunity, the land of freedom and justice for all. Rarely has a message been so obviously delivered than, I really don't care, do you, on the back of the First Lady's jacket. Her staff claimed that the jacket and the words didn't mean anything. But come on, it had a clear meaning. Melania clearly doesn't care. But one thing is not clear, and that's the target of her indifference. Does the First Lady not care about children being separated from their parents at the border? Earlier in the week, she stated that she did care, and she encouraged her husband to sign an executive order reversing this policy. And she cared enough to go to the border to listen to the pain of the children as they cried, and she heard their stories. The president had his own different interpretation of his wife's jacket than the one that her staff gave. He took to Twitter to talk for his wife and tell us that she wore it to attack the fake news media, which she just doesn't care about anymore. But some liberals suggested Melania wore the jacket in response to her husband. They think that the relationship between Melania and the president is so fraught that she wore it to tell her husband that she just doesn't care about their relationship anymore. And so we're all left with the simple words, I really don't care. Do you? I don't know if the First Lady meant her jacket in this way, but her question is the question that we as individuals and as a nation need to face. Do you really care? Do you care that immigrants and refugees, children's being torn from their parents? Or are these mothers, fathers, and children subhuman? Are they actually evil members of a violent Central American gang called MS-13? And a similar question, do you care about Muslim refugees coming from Syria to escape the horrors of war there? Or are they Syrian mothers, fathers, and children really just Islamic terrorists out to destroy our way of life? Or some others might ask, well, don't you care about immigration laws? Don't you care that immigration laws are here to keep order and safety? Do you care? Does God care? Does anyone care? I think Melania's jacket is proof that instead of making America great again, we need to make America care again. Because there's a storm brewing in our culture. It's the storm of hatred. It's the storm of racism. It's the storm of anger. It's the storm of white supremacy. It's the storm of political fear-mongering. It's the storm that is drowning us in a sense of despair as the news tells us negative story after negative story, and it's making many of us feel numb, like we just don't care anymore. And I admit to you that I am prone to this despair and this hopelessness. Sometimes it feels overwhelming, like I'm drowning in it all. You may have heard the story that went viral this last week about an Oregon DMV employee who wrote on her Facebook page that the best way to solve our immigration problem is to shoot immigrants at the border. Such hatred in any individual leads me to despair. But how did many of my fellow liberal-minded people respond to such hatred? Many went to social media to state that they wish that someone would just go ahead and kill her. This is the storm of the United States right now. We have political leaders whose primary way of solving real and perceived problems involves some form of verbal or physical violence and exclusion of others. And the primary way that many others respond in return is with our own forms of verbal and physical violence and exclusion in response. Amid this cultural storm of reciprocal hatred and violence, my friends, we need to find a third way. This third way is based on saying yes to Melania's question. It's based on making America care again. It's based on God's universal love and justice that reaches out to all people, but especially to those on the margins, especially those who are suffering. It's the universal love and justice that will calm the storm. Near the beginning of his ministry, Jesus was in Judea, teaching and preaching the good news. He was healing people and bringing them into God's realm of love. That's because Jesus cared about all people, but especially about those who are on the margins and those who are suffering. And as today's reading tells us, one day Jesus decided to cross the sea from Judea to the land of the Gerasenes. This matters because Judea was the land of the Jews, and the land of the Gerasenes was the land of the Gentiles. Many first-century Jews and Gentiles had a particular mindset about each other. That mindset was us and them. There were Gentiles and there were Jews, us and them. And often this us and them mentality came with a sense of hostility and antagonism towards one another. And so, my friends, when Jesus crossed the sea from Judea to the land of the Gerasenes, he was crossing the border of hostility between us and them. That's because for Jesus, there is no us and them. There's only us. Jesus sailed across the border to show that God's love and cares for all people, including those that many label as less than human. Jesus was exhausted that night as he crossed the sea because he had been teaching and preaching and healing, so he took a nap on the boat. While sleeping, a massive storm threatened his ship. His disciples woke Jesus up and said, "We are drowning. Do you not care that we are perishing?" And once again, we're confronted with Melania's jacket. Do you really care? Did Jesus care about the lives of his disciples? Does Jesus care about the lives of children being separated at the border from their parents? Does Jesus care that we have an us against them mentality? Or is Jeff Sessions right? And Romans 13 really does say that God ordained the American government to do whatever the hell the American government wants to do, and we just need to obey. Jesus got up, and Jesus calmed the storm. Of course, Jesus cared about his disciples in the boat. Of course, Jesus cares about immigrant families. And as much as I loathe their policies and think their interpretation of the Bible is an abomination, I know that God's love is universal. And so, of course, God cares and loves Donald Trump and the members of his administration. I constantly have to remind myself of this truth as I am working for justice. When we follow Jesus, we move away from an us against them mentality. Jesus leads us to cross the borders of hate and hostility so that we love and care for all people, including those we call our enemies. So I can work for or against any political policy, but I need to remind myself that Donald Trump and his administration are not the enemy. Hatred is the enemy. Violence is the enemy. Exclusion is the enemy. Building walls that separate us from them, that is the enemy. Indifference is the enemy. And God is not indifferent. God cares. As our passage from the prophet Isaiah tells us, even when we walk through the waters and the fires and the storms of life, we are not alone. Immigrants are not alone. Children are not alone. God walks with all of us. God is present in the pain, in the suffering, and in the trauma. The incarnation of Jesus says that God experienced that pain intimately, suffering the trauma that we impose on one another. And Jesus says that if you want to know where he is in the world today, look to the poor, the weak, the marginalized, those who are imprisoned. Look to the immigrant and the refugees, because that is where Jesus is. Jesus is at the border in those children and in those parents. Jesus is locked up in cages. The resurrected Jesus once appeared to a man named Saul. Saul was on the road to a city called Damascus, where he was going to persecute the early Christians. The resurrected Jesus came to Saul and said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul worked in tandem with the government. The government used the politics of fear to label the early Christian movement as a threat to their way of life. Like Jeff Sessions, Saul could have said to the resurrected Jesus, "Well, the government tells me I should do this, and God ordained the government, so I'm going to go kill these Christians." But instead, Saul's heart was transformed by the resurrected Christ. You see, Saul met God in the risen Jesus. He discovered that when he was persecuting other people, he was also persecuting Jesus, who is intimately connected with those who are oppressed. Why? Because with the eyes of faith, you begin to see that Jesus is present with all who are being oppressed. Mothers and fathers and children are at the border, and Jesus is at the border with them. They have traveled away from violent storms in their homelands to the United States, only to find another storm waiting for them. But God cares about them, and we care about them too. And here's where I will end. A large percentage of Americans care about them. In the face of horrible immigration policies that separate families, people have risen up and made their voices heard. Almost everyone, from fundamentalists like Franklin Graham to reformers like Pope Francis, united against this cruel policy to proclaim that immigrant families belong together. Republican and Democratic governors rebelled against the policy, and American Airlines, Delta, United, and Frontier Airlines all stated that they cared about these families and that they are refusing to allow the federal government to use their planes to transport children who have been separated from their parents. Thank God, hallelujah. And this morning, I want you to hear a word of hope. I want you to hear that love wins, that caring wins, and we have some work to do. We each have a part to play in calming the storms of hatred and violence and a lack of caring that infects our nation. But there's hope, because the voices that demand to keep children together and families together are winning. But I want us to remember the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that man named Saul that I told you about a little earlier, who tried to persecute Christians, after his conversion, he became the Apostle Paul, and he wrote Romans 12. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. My friends, there's a lot of evil in the world today, but let us not be overcome by it. In our fight for justice, let us not imitate the evil and the hateful methods that we see all around. Instead, let us overcome evil with good. Let us trust that love wins, and let us care all the more. Amen. Hi, everyone. This is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. Our worship service starts at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months we start at 10 o'clock. If you'd like more information on our church, you can visit our Facebook page or our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.